The report you're about to see was recorded before a new development in the case of Ellen Greenberg. Did she commit suicide or was she murdered? And that new development is that the case has now been taken out of the hands of the Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, who's now running for governor, and put into the hands of the Chester County District Attorney, Deb Ryan. It's in her hands now following allegations by the Greenberg family lawyer and investigators that there are clear indications of conflicts of interest on the part of Josh Shapiro. Now, Deb Ryan will see if a new investigation is warranted, and if she does, that could pave the way for an overturning of the medical examiner's finding of suicide. And that could be either to homicide or at the very least undetermined, which the parents say is the minimum in this case if justice is being fulfilled, because they say a thorough, competent, professional investigation has never been done up until this point. They've been looking for one for the past 11 years. Twice, Josh Shapiro has declared it a clear-cut suicide. Nothing to see here. Move on, folks. So it's out of his hands now. Let's see what Deb Ryan, the Chester County DA, does with this case. Of course, most observers say that they don't expect anything to happen before the midterm elections coming up quickly now because of the political implications if the finding of suicide is overturned. So stay tuned for further developments. But right now, listen to Ellen Greenberg's parents and their lawyer. Hi, everybody out there. Today, we have some very special guests who've been going through quite a bit of trauma involving the death of her daughter 11 years ago. And with us is Joe Pedraza, who is the attorney for the family. And we have with us also the mother, Sandra, and the father, Josh Greenberg. And this is all about her daughter, Ellen Greenberg, who was found stabbed to death 11 years ago in her apartment with 20 stab wounds. And the police at the time and the DA and the Attorney General all concluded that it was a suicide, despite what seemed like obvious suspicious circumstances. So, and recently, Attorney General Josh Shapiro also reviewed it, said the same thing, conclusion stand, nothing to see here. So, folks, I know you're distraught about this, and what would you say, speaking to Josh and Sandra, about, first of all, the emotional toll this has taken on you?
It's been a trying 11 years, which this occupies, I would say 90% of the time, sooner or later, if I meet a new person, I bring up the case. It does at 3 o'clock in the morning when I wake up. I'm thinking of ways of making the case work better. What happened here? Why it happened here? So to say this takes a lot of time or effort or really emotionally draining and part of my life. It's a big part of my life, and it's not a good part of my life. I don't know how without my wife and also Joe to some extent, a big extent, we'll give Joe some credit here, I would be able to, would have been able to function. I just retired recently. I was a periodontist specializing in dental treatment of gums and implants, and that gave me some salvation and some way of getting through the day or the week or the month or the year. But it's not been fun.
It's been an emotional roller coaster. It was nothing we were ever prepared to deal with. In terms of our family, we were planning for a bright future, and
we were planning a wedding.
Yeah,
we were planning a large wedding at Hershey Hotel, which is where we live in Harrisburg in South Central Pennsylvania. A very elaborate, very respected, and very fancy place to have a wedding. And we were planning a big, fancy wedding.
And so we continue to live our lives, but underneath there's tremendous anguish and heartache. But, you know, we try to power through, and not only are we trying to fight for justice for Ellen, but there are lots of families just like us that are not getting the justice that is deserving.
You say that you were planning a big wedding. Was that with the fiance, Sam Goldberg?
Yes.
This brings up the whole situation of he was the person to discover your daughter. Supposedly he broke into the apartment to get there. Since it was, how soon would the wedding have taken place before her death?
August. She was murdered in January 2011, and the wedding was planned for that August.
She had just sent out the save the date cards. I don't know if Joe and you know about these things yet, but you'll learn. But there was something we did because that's how you do a wedding.
Yeah. Was there any indication that the relation had soured between your daughter and her fiance before the death was discovered?
I cannot even say today that the relationship soured. I have suspicions, but we were not. We had no awareness, no experience. We didn't know anything that was going on. I knew my daughter was not the same. I knew my daughter wanted to come home, which made no sense to me. And not having a psychology or psychological background in education, I made a deal with my daughter because I wanted to help her because I didn't know what was going on, what was wrong, for her to see a psychiatrist. And if the psychiatrist worked it out, she could come home. My whole motivation was to make her well and not lose the job.
Yeah, part of the approach of the officials that originally investigated this and concluded suicide mentioned that she was possibly in a depressed state. She'd been taking drugs that could have caused suicidal tendencies. Did you see any of those signs talking with her leading up to her death?
She was not depressed.
No, there was no, the problem here was not depression. These people who said it was depression have no, let's put it this way, and let's just come out and right away and say it. The Attorney General and whoever reviewed this case never called experts. Ellen was sent to a well-known psychiatrist by me and my wife. They never called her. They never asked for records. They never did anything to find out what was going on.
In fact,
and we had no idea.
We were never contacted by the Attorney General.
We were never contacted by the police at the time of her death, anytime. I mean, it was absurd.
We had to really put the whole case together ourselves, and every step of the way, we have come up with so much resistance. If the word out there is that this was a suicide, what are they hiding? Why won't they give me Ellen's journal and her glasses and her boots?
Why won't they?
Why are they holding everything back from us?
We are asking three simple things. Number one, we want the manner of death, cause and manner of death changed to undecided or homicide. Number two, we would like an unbiased investigation of her death. And number three, we'd like an unbiased prosecutor or whatever to review this matter. We are not asking for the world. I mean, I think I'm asking for very little, yet I have so much resistance. I don't know if the people in Philadelphia and in this Commonwealth of Pennsylvania have anything to do but block me. Yet I don't think I'm asking for anything.
Joe,
it's very exasperating.
Joe, they're withholding her journal and other items. On what grounds are they withholding it?
Good
well, Larry,
question.
they contend that there's a privilege called CREA, that just because there was an initial investigation, any materials that were gathered by the police, the authorities still continue to contend are protected and therefore cannot be turned over to the family.
And also, there's really nothing in the way of a police report that's been released, correct?
That's correct. We're pretty much, as Sandy said, been operating blindly and literally taking the case from square one and building it to try to determine what the truth is.
Was the fiance ever considered, as far as you know, a suspect or even a person of interest?
Well, at least from the little bit of the materials that we had and the testimony that we've gotten to date, it appears that at least Dr. Osborne, who originally determined that this case was a homicide, before approximately 2 months later changing per the urging of the police and the district attorney's office, the manner of death to suicide, or changing it from homicide to suicide. Dr. Osborne did testify that in given information at the time he was determining the manner of death originally, he was told, Dr. Osborne was told information that the fiance had supplied. And according to Dr. Osborne, because his determination medically was that this is a homicide, Dr. Osborne felt that he had to discount or take with a grain of salt, to a certain extent, what was being attributed to the fiance as to what transpired. So I guess the answer to your question, that's a long way of saying it, but I guess the answer would be yes, there was at least initially a belief that the fiance would need to be looked at, as well as possibly others, as the investigation went forward.
Now, going through the records that that have been provided, whatever there are of them, a point of focus here, I think, should be what happened when the fiance discovered the body, and there seems to be some inconsistencies there in the official account and even what he said during the 911 call. Joe, could you review some of those more of the glaring inconsistencies?
Well, thank you very much. Why don't we start medically? From a medical standpoint, we've been able to prove definitively that both sides agree that Ellen has postmortem wounds. Postmortem, for the folks who are tuning in, means that these wounds were administered after Ellen was dead.
But that's been challenged. That's been challenged by the officials. That the medical examiner, which was an outside medical examiner, not hired by the family, that her answer was really not conclusive that it was postmortem, right?
Well, yeah, that's been said or suggested by representatives of the Attorney General's office. But if you look at her deposition, the neuropathologist was very clear that the wound lacked blood. Without the blood, that meant there was no pulse at the time that the stab wound was administered, which means that Ellen was dead at that time. And we know that the knife ends up in her chest eventually. So if you take what the neuropathologist says directly, you have 2 postmortem wounds, which is impossible to have administered.
All right, before we go any further on this, let's recreate the scene again. What was discovered by the fiance and how he discovered it? What was his story? What was his account of how he got into the apartment and came upon the body?
Okay. What was relayed to us was that the fiance, after a couple trips downstairs to the lobby, returned to the apartment door. The door, according to what's being relayed, was latched from the inside, and therefore, according to what's attributed to the fiance, he broke through the door, broke through the inside engaged flip lock, and as he entered the apartment, was able to observe Ellen in the kitchen area, on the floor, leaning against the cabinets with blood surrounding her.
To whom did he give that account that he broke into the apartment?
From what we understand, it was apparently given to the police department or the officers on the scene, who then in turn relayed that to the medical examiner's investigator who went to the scene. And that's what's in the medical investigator's report.
Yet, when he made the 911 call, he said he walked into the apartment. He didn't mention breaking in, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, so that's an inconsistency. In addition, the nature of this lock is such that there are 2 posts that connect, one to the door, one to the jamb of the door.
All right, hold on a minute. So he initially claimed he broke into the apartment by breaking the lock. Describe the lock.
If for your viewers, this is your typical flip lock that you'll see at a hotel, where the one arm flips over, there's a ball that engages, and as you attempt to open the door, the ball engages the groove, and it comes to almost like a triangle, stopping the door from opening. one side is connected to the door jamb, the other side is connected to the door so that it creates that V that prevents the door from ultimately opening totally.
Is there any way that that could be manipulated from the outside to look like it was locked from the inside when it was not?
Yeah, actually, we discovered in recent YouTube videos, as well as literature that existed, that it is quite easy to engage that lock after you've walked outside of the door, or to disengage it while you're on the outside of the door trying to come in while it's engaged. So it's very simple to manipulate that lock.
Right now, also another peculiarity here is that originally he told the investigators that a security guard accompanied him to the door and they broke it down together. And yet the security guard was later interviewed and he denies that he accompanied him to the door or was with him at any time, correct?
That's correct, Larry. The security guard was absolutely clear that at no time did he ever accompany the fiance up to the 6th floor where the apartment was located, and never was at the scene or observed anything that the fiance did.
And it's, I guess from what I could gather from what information there is, the investigators claim that, well, somebody else could have let him in to the door, but who was that somebody else? They ever attempt to find out who that somebody else was?
Well, we don't know what efforts have been made to do so, but to date, they've been unable to identify anyone who would fit that role of having been an observer at the time of entrance to the apartment.
All right, the nature of the wounds, 20 stab wounds from an 8-inch knife, correct?
Yes.
And at least one or several were after death.
That's correct.
Now, let me ask Josh and Sandra, did Ellen, was there any self-abuse or was there any past history of her hurting herself or threatening suicide or threatening to hurt herself?
No. In fact, if anything, Ellen once had an ear pierced and she was going to go to get the second ear pierced. And I told her this was going to be not fun. It's not going to hurt. It's going to be whatever. She never went.
She chickened out.
There was also one other thing about the knife wounds. I believe some of the wounds were with a serrated knife and some with a straight blade knife,
Smooth edge.
smooth edged.
And that was determined definitively that there might have
If
been.
you read the autopsy report and the way they describe the various wounds, some have a jagged edge and some have a smooth edge.
But Ellen, in fact, we used to go to vacation during Christmas time, and we didn't want her to, she came to one night and she wanted to go down in Acapulco with some boys to a senior frog club or something. That was the last time we went to Acapulco. We took her then the next time on a ship because we knew she would not look over the railing to do anything. She was very much into.
She loved herself
right.
too much.
She loved herself too much to hurt herself.
And Joe, the medications that she was taking, they're claiming, the investigators, that the combination of them could have induced suicidal tendencies. You say no way.
Yeah, that's the first that I'm hearing, Larry. We haven't even heard the city make that accusation. The prescriptions were by a doctor, a psychiatrist, well-respected here in the area. They were pretty routine for anxiety, again, for anxiety, because that was the condition diagnosed, and it was minor anxiety. And the toxicology reports indicate that there were trace amounts of what would be expected of the prescription drugs, too minor to have influenced behavior. So for anybody to even suggest otherwise would be an outlier.
And over the years, Josh and Sandra, your daughter was fairly stable emotionally and mentally.
Yes.
Very. In fact,
Very responsible.
The familial insult by my wife regarding my daughter was she was just like me. So that was not meant as a compliment. I don't know if you gentlemen ever have that, but I'm going to also throw up one other thing. The psychiatrist in the notes said not suicidal.
Right. Yeah. All right. Another peculiarity here is the sequence of the calls. Before he called 911, he talked to several other people, right, Joe?
That's correct, Larry. Yeah, quite a few folks he did have contact with before 911. In fact, over a period of approximately, say, almost a 2 hour to 2.5 hour period, others were contacted before 911.
And who were those others?
Ranged from family members to father, to an uncle, to the uncle's son, which would be a cousin to him, to a friend, and in fact, a telephone call to Sandy. So to the Greenberg home, where he spoke for about 2 minutes with Sandy.
The uncle was a lawyer.
Correct. In fact, his specialty, if I'm not mistaken, is white collar crime, which would be a defense of usually white collar criminals.
So we have the fiance breaking into the apartment, quote, breaking in, finding his loved one on the floor, 20 stab wounds. And, but before he calls 911, he's talking with all these other people.
For a period of time.
Well, I was going to say, I don't want to confuse this there, Larry, that the calls with the other folks all occurred prior to entry into the apartment, apparently.
Right.
So as far as we know, there was no entry into the apartment. Who knows? I mean, that's something that needs to be investigated. But before that 911 call is made, yes, there were assorted people that were spoken to over that nearly 2.5 hour period.
I mean, that in itself should at least elicit some questioning from the fiance, I would say. Why would you call these other people first?
One would think, particularly given the amount of time that one is standing outside a door looking for entrance in, your loved one on the other end or inside, and not knowing apparently, what had happened to that person or might have happened to that person.
Now, another peculiarity on the 911 call, first he says there's blood all over. He can't see where it's coming from. He determines, I don't know how at that point, that there are no broken bones. But then when he's asked to do CPR on her by the 911 caller, he somehow discovers the knife that's sticking through her, what was it, a sweatshirt she had over. So the knife should have been apparent right off before, while he was saying that he doesn't know what happened, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And the knife is literally sticking out of Ellen's chest, say approximately 6 to 8 inches. It's brown handle against a gray sweatshirt.
So that would have been apparent right off, but according to the 911 call, what he said on that, it's like he can't see where the wounds are coming from, correct?
That's the sense that we got from the review of the 911 tape, yes.
Is there any logical explanation for that?
Well, we don't know, but these are the questions that exist that need to be explored, have not been explored, not to mention the indication by the pathologist of bruising on Ellen's body, which has never been looked into as to the cause and reasons for them. These are the questions that are raised in what we consider to be not only an insufficient but a grossly deficient investigation by the police.
So there were some bruises that were fresh, correct?
Correct. As well as there were multiple bruises. We're not talking a few. We're talking bruising on the legs throughout the thighs, bruising on the arms, in varying degrees of healing. That's what the autopsy report indicates, that Dr. Osborne saw this all over Ellen's body, and yet there's no interest in trying to ascertain why are these bruises in varying degrees of healing on her body.
Now, the knife wounds themselves, 20 of them, and a number of them in the back of her head. And first of all, isn't that a very awkward place to stab yourself? I mean, physically, isn't that difficult to do?
Yeah, it would be, Larry. And in fact, when you recreate the stabbing, it is virtually impossible from a physiological or biomechanical standpoint for Ellen to have self-inflicted these wounds. some of which are very high on her head, where the thought of her having leverage with the length of this knife just doesn't make any sense.
The gash in her head, was that also done by a knife?
Yes, in fact, but we believe that it's the same knife that would have caused that gash, a very considerable one on the top back of her head.
Now, all these plunges of the knife into her, would each one of them have been sufficiently intense in pain to perhaps discourage her from continuing to stab herself?
Certainly, they would have been painful, no matter which one you're considering, some of which would have been completely incapacitating.
Did you say that one of the calls he made prior to calling 911 was to Sandra?
Yes, to Sandy earlier, yes.
Could you describe that call for us, Sandra? What she said, or what he said to you?
Well, what was kind of unusual is that he called the landline, not my cell phone. And he was not able to get a hold of Ellen, so we wanted to know, had I spoken to her, recently? And the answer is no, I only had spoken with her in the morning. And I just, brushed it off like, oh, maybe she's, blowing her hair out, or, maybe she, was involved in something. I said, just give it a few minutes. And then, I don't hear from anyone for several hours until Sam's father called us and said something terrible has happened to Ellie.
When you talked with her before the call from the fiance,
That was at roughly 7 o'clock in the morning.
7 o'clock in the morning, which was how many hours before the incidents?
Well, she was pronounced dead at 6:40, roughly. And that's PM. And I spoke with her at around 7 a.m. And we were discussing things like keeping receipts and getting things ready for the accountant for taxes. And that's the most vivid part of my discussion with her. But it was a normal, she was very much in control and, taught school at the end of the day when the day was cut short because of the impending snowstorm. She had to try to reach and account for each child's parent to know that they were going to be receiving their children earlier.
She didn't have to. That's what she did.
During that conversation, Sandra, did you pick up anything in terms of an increased tension, anxiety, or unhappiness? Anything that would indicate increased issues that she was dealing with?
No.
So it seemed pretty normal conversation with your daughter, conversations that you've had many times before. Nothing seemed to be amiss.
No, I wasn't suspicious of anything.
Yeah. Well, to me, this is being an investigative reporter for a number of years. This seems like a case that's just begging for more investigation. Now, Josh, you think at the very least that this was a sloppy investigation, and once they came to their original conclusion, that is the conclusion of suicide, that they were not going to get off that point. They're going to stick with their original conclusion. Was it merely because you suspect that it was just incompetence?
No. First of all, I grew up trusting the police. And Sandy and I had a disagreement because I said the police said what was what, and Ellen was not the same. But as things came about and as we started investigating, like we started with Cyril Wecht. Mm-hmm. Cyril Wecht gave us an article. It was just an article that you would use to teach police to differentiate between suicide and homicide. The first thing the article says is women don't commit suicide with a knife. If you go on Google and you Google female suicide with knife, you get nothing. You don't even get Ellen for that matter. Number two, they don't do that, if they do it at all, through their clothes. This went through her clothes. So right away, well, not right away, but he gave me an answer that was insufficient for me, but it led to us to go on, and that was suspicious of homicide. I would have liked a stronger answer. I was, again, if you remember, I'm a periodontist, so I'm a dentist, but I have more dental training in histology and wound healing and all those things. So I'm not a physician, but I understand these things. And his answer led us to start going on and on and on. I don't know, did I answer your question?
Yeah, so Cyril, what concluded possible homicide?
Suspicious of homicide. When our investigator went to question him, or say, question him, he didn't understand why I never called him back. As far as he was concerned, that's as strong as he's going to get, probably, because he has to, we're in a litigious world, even though Mr. Pedrosa is with us today, but we're in a litigious world and he has to be careful what he says. And, I wanted definitely suicide. I mean, homicide. I'm sorry. But that's what he did. He was shocked that I didn't call him back.
Yeah, I've interviewed Wecht a number of times over the years. Joe, so what do you suspect? Just simple incompetence?
Larry, there's certainly evidence of that. We have evidence that the next day, before the pathologist has a chance to rule on the manner of death, the police did something that is extremely unusual. That they allowed folks to go onto the premises, and before that, they allowed for a crime scene cleanup to occur before the autopsy was even completed, and before they knew what the manner of death was going to be determined. And at that time, it became homicide, but there were these interferences with the crime scene were allowed to happen.
Who cleaned it up?
That's incompetent.
Who cleaned it
I'm
up?
sorry?
Who cleaned up the crime scene?
Well, from what we understand, the property manager was given the name of a crime scene cleanup company from the police itself, told that if you want to clean the premises up to allow people to come on the premises, you'll have to pay for it or arrange for the payment. And the property manager then in turn reached out to the crime scene company and arranged for a cleanup on January 27th, which is the next day after Ellen was found.
And I understand the cell phones and the laptops were taken by the uncle or the uncle's kid.
Well, that's another very strange thing, that the police approved the access to the premises by the uncle, the lawyer uncle, and the lawyer uncle's son. And they went onto the premises apparently to retrieve a suit and shoes for the fiance for the upcoming funeral. And in addition, removed 2 of Ellen's laptops, the fiance's laptop, Ellen's cell phone, and the fiance's cell phone, and kept them in their possession for over 48 hours before they returned them to the police.
Isn't that highly irregular, if not a violation of protocol?
There's no question about that. I'm flabbergasted that anybody was allowed in the apartment before the pathologist had rendered a decision on manner of death. And remember, Larry, at that time, the pathologist will come back and say it's a homicide. And yet now you've allowed all these strangers onto the crime scene.
Yeah. And then later on, the police examined the laptops and the cell phone and found nothing incriminating.
That's true, Larry. And it's not just the police. It's the FBI lab here locally, which is the most professional and most proficient and most objective review of the laptop. The laptop was sent, Ellen's was sent to the FBI lab, and they reported back to the Philadelphia Police Department that there is no indication of any obsession or any suicidal trends of searches on her laptop.
Would any of the information on the laptops or the cell phones have been scrubbed before the FBI got a hold of it?
Always a possibility. There are forensic experts who can do many things.
But there was no indication in the FBI report that anything had been removed prior.
Correct, but they would not have had a baseline. All they would have had is that laptop as it then existed at the time they received it, and that was received by the FBI after the uncle returned the laptop to the police.
Yeah, also, another interesting point here is that the original DA who came to the conclusion that it was suicide, what was his name and what happened to him in more recent years?
Well, as I understand it, it was the district attorney at that time was District Attorney Seth Williams, who would later run into legal difficulties himself and have to step down as the district attorney, subject to, I believe it was a federal prosecution.
You know what it was about?
That I can't remember, but I thought it had something to do with possible misuse of campaign funds for personal purposes.
All right, now.
But I'm not certain.
All right, now the investigators under Seth Williams, District Attorney's Office, were part of that original finding that was suicide. Now, where are those same investigators now who used to work with the DA, Seth Williams?
Attorney General's office. Quite a few of them are now at the Attorney General's office.
And the Attorney General currently is Josh Shapiro, who's running for governor, and he has concluded that all the original conclusions, not the original, but the finding of suicide is correct, nothing further to investigate, correct?
That's correct.
So if he actually reviewed the material, I presume that among those helping him with the review would be the same officials who were originally working with DA Seth Williams, correct?
Yeah, not a presumption, Larry. It's the truth. It's an actual fact that folks who were in the district attorney's office in 2011, when the discussions were made to change the manner of death from homicide to suicide, those folks later then went to the Attorney General's office and in fact have been involved in the reconsideration while the matter is with the Attorney General's office.
Now, shouldn't that be considered, or isn't it, a conflict of interest?
Well, one would think so, Larry. I don't think you need a law degree to figure that one out.
So where does this leave you guys at this point? I mean, you've asked for a review. It's 11 years now, and you say now it's the only, the last stop here is what, an appellate court?
Well, originally, Larry, if we step back, we were right at the threshold of trial, which would have been an opportunity for us to lay out all these facts in even greater detail than we're reviewing here today, with full transparency in front of an objective, disinterested judge to decide what should be done in this case. And at the 11th hour, the city asked for an appeal by permission to the appellate court, an intermediate appellate court, regarding legal issues, whether we can actually do this, whether we, meaning the Greenbergs, on behalf of their daughter, can ask for this death certificate to be changed because it does not make sense and has no support in reason or facts. The appellate court has accepted that appeal, so therefore a stay has been entered of the trial, meaning we cannot go forward with the trial. And now we've been diverted up to appeal to deal with these legal issues. And depending upon how they get resolved, we'll know whether we go forward with the trial, or there's a possibility that this case could end on appeal with a decision saying the family has no right to challenge a manner of death determination about their daughter, which is indefensible.
And there'd be no recourse after that, nothing you could do to get this case reopened or further investigated?
Well, not along the routes of an estate, meaning what we've done right now, asking for a court to do that determination. But there's other avenues available to the family that we'll have to take up at that, the appropriate time.
Can you specify any of that?
Sure. What this family has gone through is unconscionable, meaning that we believe that the evidence that we've just been able to develop now through our efforts to date is such to show that there has been an active concealment of a matter that should be a homicide and be investigated as a homicide through the officials, including those in the medical examiner's office. In these type of circumstances, there are cases that would authorize the green light to go forward with a lawsuit for such willful misconduct against these public officials, particularly for the outrageous emotional distress that they've caused this family over 12 years, despite knowing that the determination of suicide is indefensible.
So there are avenues beyond what the appeal court rules. Even the appeal court shuts you down, there are still these other avenues.
There are these other avenues, but you never know if other walls will be put up as we go down those avenues.
Joe, so what's your reading on how competent the original investigators were, the police, the DA's office, et cetera, right at the beginning?
There have been some questions raised about the competency, and I'm not going to say competency as much as lack of interest by the officers in actually going forth in a full-blown investigation. I have actually received an anonymous call now about 6 months ago, where a present officer on the police department warned me that that district in particular was basically a haven where officers who may have had some problems were sent because it was a low crime district so that they could put their time in and attain retirement and then, move on to other things. So it was suggested to me by this anonymous officer that perhaps a vigorous, competent investigation cannot be assumed at that district at that time.
I see you're weighing your words very carefully. Now, you mentioned active concealment. Does that equal conspiracy?
At this time, Larry, I'm going to go on record saying yes. We feel comfortable that we can say that, and I'll tell you why. When we deposed the cities, this is the city employee neuropathologist, and this professional testifies under oath that the only sample of the spinal cord that exists of Ellen was retained because it shows a stab wound that was inflicted after Ellen was dead. And that neuropathologist then says back in August of 2019, she shared that specific result with the then city medical examiner, told the medical examiner, you have a post-mortem wound. And there's no record of that discussion. There's no record anywhere written that of a neuropathologist finding a post-mortem wound. And yet everybody in that office knew it, and they did not do what they were obligated professionally to do, which was to voluntarily change the death certificate. Yeah, I'd say that's a bit of a conspiracy to hide a homicide. The knowledge was there and they chose to ignore it.
So what you're alleging is there's a conspiracy to cover up the true nature of Ellen's death.
At this point, we think the evidence points that way. Yes, there's been a concealment. That concealment started sometime in 2011, and it's continued to this date, which is demonstrated clearly by the neuropathologist saying back in August of 2019, she told the medical examiner there's a post-mortem wound. And if you have a post-mortem wound in a stabbing case, that means almost by definition, it can't be a suicide.
And that was to the back of the neck, correct?
That's correct. That's what we call the stab wound to between the C2 and the C3 of her spinal column.
Josh and Sandra, what are you hoping at this point? Have you given up hope that you're really going to get anywhere with this after all these roadblocks? How optimistic are you that you will finally get to the bottom of what happened to your daughter?
I'm very optimistic. The more we find out, the longer this goes on, more details turn up, and the public is witnessing everything. And someone's going to have to answer some questions.
I have total confidence in Joe. We both do. I know attorneys sometimes don't have the best reputations, but this gentleman makes that all into nothing. He has been more than an attorney and then some. And you can tell how he feels about this case. And we have tremendous confidence in him. We have 100% confidence that we're going to we're going to win. If it's a win that you want to call it. We have a mission, and that's to get justice for our daughter. And we're going to get justice for our daughter. This is not over, and it's not going to, I'm numb from dealing with these people, especially the Attorney General's office, which has done nothing but make me feel that they are incompetent and liars. I maybe shouldn't say those things. I'll get a tongue lashing later on. But I mean, what they do is absurd. It's ridiculous. It's disgusting.
They should be ashamed of themselves.
I mean, if he sees on the 11th anniversary of our daughter's death, they wrote a press release that was so bad, so incompetent, so immoral, so disgusting that I can't wait till somebody really asks me what he said so I can go through it. In fact, I've written something and I have it being somebody proofreading it for me on letters to the editor. Unfortunately, Mr. Pedrosa doesn't know that yet. And I don't know what he'll say when he sees it, but I wrote about our experience with the Attorney General's office from the first time in 2018 to 2022. And we haven't even gone into half of that today. And I apologize if I'm misspeaking, if I did something wrong. I'm her father. And this is what my daughter would want for me to do for her, want us to do for her. And it keeps us together and it makes life bearable in an unbearable situation.
Sandra, you have the final word.
It's just, I never could have made up the amount of goofs with the public officials. And just because they're a public official doesn't give them the right to say whatever they want.
Well, Sandra and Josh Greenberg, parents of Ellen, and Attorney Joe Pedrosa, thanks very much for being with us. And as this continues, we'll be talking more. And my heart goes out to you. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
Before we leave you, I, the Greenbergs, and Attorney Pedrosa want to make something absolutely clear. And here it is.
Have it on your tape that it is quite clear that we are not accusing anyone, and
Right.
that would include the fiance, of murder, homicide, or any inappropriate misconduct. All we're asking for is there are issues that have arisen that need to be addressed before an investigation can be deemed concluded, and suicide is not tenable under any circumstance, and under our law that needs to be changed if it has to be compelled by a court. That's all we're saying at this point.